April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Conches, France. The oxygen mask could not hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermaken's smirk as he leaned into the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf. From above, he watched the ungainly silhouettes of American fighters straining upward in the thin air, climbing awkwardly toward his formation. Over the radio he mocked them, telling his wingman, "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles," his laughter breaking the cold silence of the sky. Below him, 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the U.S. 4th Fighter Group pushed upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines roaring with effort as they hauled nearly 7 tons of fuel, steel and firepower to German pilots who had grown accustomed to dueling with the slender Spitfires or the quick-turning Soviet Yaks. The new American machines looked like a parody of fighter design, barrel-shaped fuselages with bulbous canopies, disproportionately small wings and propellers, so large they dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. Yet what Hermaken and the other German veterans circling above could not have guessed was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would piece by piece dismantle the Luftwaffe's air superiority. Within just 18 months, these same flying milk bottles would no longer inspire laughter. Armed with 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each Thunderbolt could unleash more than 6,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to saw a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf in half in less than 2 seconds. With 3,400 rounds of ammunition stored in those broad wings, mathematics itself had become a weapon. The transformation began that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 3rd Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation maneuvering into position. Blakesley was no stranger to combat, a veteran of the RF Eagle squadrons. He had flown Spitfires in the desperate skies over Britain. Unlike his men, he already understood that the Thunderbolt demanded an entirely new style of combat. It was not built to outturn or outdance an enemy. Its survival depended on speed in the dive, the altitude advantage of its turbo-supercharger, and the devastating storm of lead that erupted when its 8 Brownings opened fire. For the Americans, this was baptism by fire. Spread across the French sky were 56 U.S. pilots, many flying in combat for the first time, facing opponents who had been fighting without pause since 1939. The Luftwaffe's veterans had cut their teeth in Poland, France, Britain, and above the vast Russian steppes. The Americans had been in combat for precisely 0 days, yet despite this imbalance, industrial power and new design philosophy were about to challenge the accumulated experience of Germany's best. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself had been born from a moment of panic in June. As German fighters swept across France, Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, was handed an urgent request from the U.S. Army Air Corps: create a high-altitude interceptor capable of countering the Luftwaffe's deadliest machine. Kartveli admitted to his team that what they were about to build was a monster. "It will be a dinosaur," he confessed, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the prototype XP-47B first took to the skies on May 6, 1941, it stunned even hardened test pilots. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed almost 2/3 more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Its vast turbo-supercharger system, with ducting that wound through the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft a bloated, almost pregnant look. Pilots approaching it for the first time often asked the same question: how could something this enormous ever hope to fight like a fighter? This thing actually flew. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else. Once it reached the heights where air combat was increasingly fought. At the heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower, coupled with its massive turbo supercharger, which recycled hot exhaust gases to compress the thin air. The P-47, could deliver almost sea-level performance even at altitudes where Messerschmitt Bf-12-9s and Focke-Wulf 90s gasped for oxygen. The Thunderbolt remained a bellowing brute, yet its path to becoming a legend was anything but smooth. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the newly formed 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially loathed the machine. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents alone. The P-47 killed more Americans in practice than Germans would during its opening months of combat. Its vices were deadly. It could ground loop on landing, torque roll violently on takeoff, and dive so eagerly that it introduced US pilots to a terrifying new phenomenon, compressibility. As the aircraft approached transonic speeds, shock waves formed along the wings, freezing the controls and sending some Thunderbolts into unrecoverable plunges. But those who endured its harsh lessons found themselves in command of something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, who would later score 27 confirmed victories and become one of America's top aces, recalled his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first clashes in April and May of 1943, however, seemed to prove every German prejudice correct. Thunderbolts could not outturn the F-190s, nor could they climb with the Messerschmitt Bf-12-9s. At medium altitudes, they lacked the nimble handling of either enemy machine. Luftwaffe pilots quickly devised tactics to exploit these weaknesses, diving from below to force the P-47s into turning fights where agility, not raw firepower, determined survival. Major Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgewehr 26, reported to headquarters after his first engagement with the Thunderbolts. His assessment dripped with contempt. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. German pilots began calling them Indians, big, slow targets dressed up for war. Early numbers seemed to confirm German confidence. In their first month of combat, US Thunderbolt units lost 14 aircraft, while claiming only 3 confirmed kills. The British, observing from the cockpit of their sleek Spitfires, quietly suggested that the Americans might reconsider their choice of mount. Some RAF veterans joked that the most effective evasive maneuver in a P-47 was simply to unstrap and run around inside its cavernous cockpit. And yet hidden within those early setbacks was a detail German intelligence failed to appreciate. The P-47s that went down had endured punishment far beyond what any Spitfire or Messerschmitt could have survived. On May 4, one Thunderbolt returned to base, with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes scarring its airframe. In another instance, a P-47 limped home with half its tail shredded and cylinders missing from its radial engine. The secret lay in the aircraft's rugged design. Its massive air-cooled radial engine lacked the fragile coolant lines of liquid-cooled German fighters, meaning hits that would have instantly crippled a Bf-12-9 or FW-190 merely scarred the Thunderbolt. The aircraft could absorb incredible damage, shrugging off blows that would have disintegrated anything else in the sky. The Germans laughed at the flying milk bottle, but slowly, without realizing it, they were coming face to face with a war machine built not to win duels through elegance, but to outlast, overpower, and ultimately overwhelm. When the P-47s did manage to bring their guns to bear, the effect was catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's battery of 8 /50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns created a convergence zone of destruction that no Luftwaffe pilot had ever experienced before. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters, or German 20mm cannons that carried only a handful of seconds of ammunition, the American fighter could sustain continuous fire for more than 30 seconds, an eternity in the split-second world of aerial combat. The event that began to shift German perceptions unfolded on June 26, 1943, over Lille, France. It involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, and would become one of the most legendary encounters in the air war. Johnson was part of a 48-plane P-47 formation, returning from bomber escort duty, when they were ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulf F-22 of Taiwan Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Gulland, the younger brother of the famed ace Adolf Gulland. The Germans executed a textbook attack, diving from the sun with speed and precision. Johnson, flying near the rear of the American formation, was caught in the crossfire. In the first moments of the engagement, his Thunderbolt was hammered by 20 20mm cannon shells and dozens of machine gun strikes. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, and fire broke out behind the instrument panel. Johnson was wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments. When he tried to bail out, he discovered his canopy had been fused shut, jammed in place by a 20mm shell that had exploded in the track. At 27,000 feet, he was trapped in a burning, dying aircraft. What followed defied every assumption about survivability in aerial warfare. Half blinded by oil covering his windscreen, flying with an engine coughing on the verge of seizure and fighting controls that barely responded, Johnson somehow stabilized the P-47 and turned it toward the English Channel. But his ordeal was far from over. A lone Foblu 190, flown by an unidentified pilot of Jabo 26, spotted the crippled Thunderbolt, limping along at barely 170 miles per hour. To this day, historians have debated the German pilot's identity, but his actions became the stuff of legend. Positioning behind Johnson, he opened fire with his full armament, 4 20mm cannon, and 2 13mm machine guns. Johnson could do nothing but hunch behind his armor plate and pray. The P-47 soaked up the entire cannon ammunition load. When the cannons clicked empty, the German pressed the attack with his machine guns. Again Johnson's aircraft shuddered, but refused to fall. Frustrated and disbelieving, the German pulled alongside, his blonde face clearly visible through the canopy. Johnson later recalled seeing his opponent's expression shift from confidence to confusion, and then to something approaching fear. The German saluted with a wave, pulled away, and disappeared out of ammunition, out of options, and perhaps shaken by the realization that the American fighter could endure what should have been certain death. Johnson somehow coaxed his ruined Thunderbolt across the channel and brought it down at Manston Airfield. The aircraft barely held together on landing, collapsing on the runway as the engine finally gave out. His crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 2. One cannon shell had detonated inches from Johnson's head, another had exploded against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had been ripped apart, the control cables nearly severed, and 3 of the 4 main fuselage longerons, the backbone of the airframe, were shot clean through, yet the aircraft had brought its pilot home. The survival of Johnson's P-47 sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers inspecting the wreck realized they had underestimated the resilience of their own creation. German intelligence, at first, refused to believe the reports from Jabo 26 pilots, insisting that no aircraft could withstand such punishment. But the testimony was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had at a single Thunderbolt, and the machine had lived. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to understand what they truly had in their hands. Under the relentless leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hube Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group had discovered, through bitter trial and error, the secret of unleashing the P-47's true strength. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them. At low altitude, use your weight, use your power, use your guns. This became the mantra drilled into every new Thunderbolt pilot. The very mass of the aircraft, once considered a crippling disadvantage, was transformed into its deadliest weapon. In a dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could plunge to speeds of over 550 miles per hour. Faster than any German fighter could achieve, even in a vertical dive.
That speed could then be converted into altitude again, a zoom climb that left Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs floundering far below. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, perfected what came to be known as
boom and zoom tactic. Pilots had their own nickname for it, the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Rather than engaging in turning duels, entire P-47 formations would cruise at altitudes above 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could operate effectively. When the Luftwaffe appeared beneath them, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive like thunderbolts indeed, streaking down at such velocity that defensive fire or evasive maneuvers were useless. At the bottom of these dives, 8 heavy machine guns would unleash a storm that German survivors later described as like flying into a wall of lead. Aircraft caught inside the 6-foot-wide convergence zone of those guns did not simply go down, they disintegrated. The true revelation of American firepower came on August 17, 1943, during the dual raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. It was the deepest penetration into Germany attempted up to that point, and a mission that would test both the Thunderbolt's limitations and its terrifying effectiveness. Range remained the great weakness. Even with external drop tanks, the P-47 could not escort the bombers all the way to their targets. But when the Luftwaffe committed its twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstörer destroyers to attack the B-17s, the Thunderbolts had their chance. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, spotted a formation of Bf 110s maneuvering into firing position. These heavy fighters carried cannons, rockets, and even 37mm anti-bomber weapons, but they were slow and unwieldy compared to single-engine interceptors. Schilling and 3 other P-47s rolled into their dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth, a gunner aboard one of the German destroyers, who later survived the battle, recalled the encounter during interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters. I saw good hits strike the wing of one Thunderbolt. It did not even wobble. Then it fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. It was not shot down. It was destroyed. The wings separated, the tail was cut away, and the fuselage broke into confetti. In seconds, a 110 became nothing. In less than a minute, 8 Bf 110s and Day 210s were destroyed by a handful of Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe had never experienced such overwhelming sustained firepower. Each P-47 carried 125 rounds per gun, for a total of 3,400 rounds, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At a convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 guns focused their streams of bullets into a killing zone, no more than 6 feet across. Anything caught in that space was struck by roughly 100 projectiles every second, each one moving at nearly 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself was a product of American industrial ingenuity. Combat belts mixed armor-piercing incendiary API tracers, and standard ball ammunition, ensuring not only structural destruction, but also ignition of fuel tanks and onboard systems. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would finish the war as America's top ace in Europe, with 28 victories, put it bluntly: when you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I once saw a 109 cut in half. The tail going one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never even knew what hit him. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was facing a grim realization. The Thunderbolt's performance only grew more fearsome with altitude. Thanks to its turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine, the P-47 maintained full power up to 30,000 feet, while German fighters equipped with single or two-stage mechanical superchargers began to wither above 25,000. For bomber escort duty, this was decisive. While Messerschmitt strained and lost power in the thin air, The Thunderbolt remained a roaring juggernaut, its guns ready to defend the bombers that carried the war into Germany's heartland. The Luftwaffe had begun by mocking the P-47 as a lumbering milk bottle. By the end of 1943, the laughter was gone. What once seemed a clumsy brute had revealed itself as a war machine of terrifying endurance, power, and destructive potential, an industrial-age monster that symbolized the weight of American industry and the shifting tide of the air war over Europe. On October 8, 1943, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most celebrated aces, with 206 confirmed victories, met the harsh reality of the Thunderbolt. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf Ward 190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin stratospheric air. The BMW 801 radial, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove from 32,000 feet, the German fighters became sitting ducks. Among them was Robert S. Johnson, already a veteran pilot on his way to becoming an ace. Flying at 31,000 feet, Johnson spotted Philipp's Zipperlebu on 90, instantly recognizable, with its elaborate nose art. His combat report was clinical, opened fire at 300 yards. 30-degree deflection, observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. Philipp's sudden death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. This was no ordinary pilot. He had survived over 500 combat missions on both the Eastern and Western fronts. If one of their very best could be destroyed so swiftly, what chance did ordinary pilots have? The High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report presented to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was grim. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. In a dive it approached the transonic barrier, achieving speeds few German aircraft dared to attempt. Its armor protection included a midi-inch steel plate behind the pilot, a half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and heavy deflection plates around its massive engine. Most alarming of all, its rugged construction allowed it to withstand damage that would destroy 2 or 3 German fighters and still limp home. In January 1944, a new variant arrived in England that pushed the P-47 from formidable to nightmare fuel. The P-47 D-22 introduced a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with 13-foot paddle blades. These broad-chord blades bit into the air with immense force, transforming the Thunderbolt's climb performance. Early variants had struggled at 2,200 feet per minute at sea level. The paddle blade models clawed skyward at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, finally matching and often exceeding Bf-109s and Fw-190s at combat altitudes. The improvement wasn't only in climb rate. The massive new prop also delivered explosive acceleration in level flight. Luftwaffe pilots noticed the change immediately. Hermann Friedrich Fritz Nock, a veteran of more than 200 combat missions, with Jagdgeschwader 11 encountered the upgraded Thunderbolts during a bomber interception near Hanover in February. In his diary he wrote, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and followed us up. At 30,000 feet, Schmitt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller also gave the Thunderbolt a new voice. At high power, the blade tips pushed into the supersonic range, producing a deep, thundering roar that could be heard for miles. German troops on the ground reported they could identify approaching Thunderbolts by sound alone. A low, menacing rumble they nicknamed Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. By March 1944,
P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. Standard loadouts carried 208-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, stretching operational range beyond 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade prop restoring performance even when fully laden, Thunderbolts could fight effectively immediately after dropping tanks. The Luftwaffe, desperate to stem the American daylight offensive, began focusing attacks directly on the bombers. But to reach them, they had to fly through the P-47 escort screen, a strategy that was increasingly suicidal. Respect turned to dread. Major Günther Rauhl, one of Germany's top surviving aces with 275 victories, recalled an encounter on March 6, 1944. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone joked, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing. 30 seconds later, they came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone. Their guns didn't fire in bursts, like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. To be caught in that stream meant instant death." Escort missions revealed another Thunderbolt advantage: endurance. German fighters, operating at maximum power, guzzled fuel and had little time over the battlefield. By contrast, the Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney radial could cruise efficiently at high altitude, allowing it to remain with bomber formations for hours. P-47 squadrons rotated top cover, ensuring a constant shield of protection, while still having fuel for combat and return. By spring 1944, as the P-51 Mustang arrived to assume primary long-range escort duty, the Thunderbolt shifted toward a new role: ground attack. With its rugged airframe, heavy firepower and ability to carry bombs and rockets, it became the most feared Allied aircraft for German troops on the ground. This transformation began in earnest in April 1944, as the Allies prepared for the greatest operation of the war, the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved just as devastating against ground targets as it had against enemy fighters. Its standard armor-piercing incendiary rounds could pierce the thin top armor of most German vehicles, while the sheer weight of fire turned convoys into twisted wreckage in seconds. A 2-second burst from all 850 caliber Brownings meant more than 160 half-inch projectiles, ripping into an area no larger than a truck, enough to obliterate soft targets, or ignite fuel and ammunition with terrifying efficiency. What transformed the Thunderbolt from a fearsome escort into a true battlefield monster was the addition of bombs and rockets. The P-47 D-25 could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs beneath its wings and another 500-pounder under the fuselage, giving it a strike load equal to that of many early war medium bombers. Later versions bristled with zero-length launch rails for up to 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each one with the destructive force of a 105mm artillery shell. In a single attack run, one fighter could unleash the equivalent firepower of an entire artillery battery, but with precision delivered at hundreds of miles per hour. German troops who survived such onslaughts never forgot them. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 25th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, recalled the terror of those low-flying Thunderbolts. They came in so low you could see the pilot's faces. The sound was unbearable, engines roaring, rockets shrieking, and then the hammering of the machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles vanished in fire and smoke in one pass. The men were shaken to their core. They called them Jabos, fighter bombers, but these were something else. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe learned just how completely the balance of power had shifted. More than 500 P-47s covered the Normandy beaches, forming a towering shield of American firepower. German pilots who tried to reach the invasion zone found themselves trapped in a killing ground. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German airmen to return from an attack run that day, remembered bitterly. The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn with 12 fighters from our grupper. I was the only one who came back. You couldn't climb over them. You couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our machines into aluminum rain. The weeks following D-Day became a nightmare for German logistics. P-47s prowled the roads and railways of France, hunting in daylight with near impunity. Entire armored columns disappeared beneath their guns and bombs. Rail yards burned, locomotives lay scattered and gutted across the countryside, and the Wehrmacht was reduced to creeping along by night like hunted prey. Even then, radar and night fighting patrols stalked the German attempts to counter the menace, reinforcing vehicle armor, deploying heavier flak guns, devising elaborate camouflage nets, failed against the Thunderbolts' blend of speed, armor, and overwhelming firepower. Even the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft batteries, so lethal against Allied bombers, often found themselves unable to track the fast-moving fighters hurtling just above the treetops. And while the P-47s were devastating Europe, their reputation was spreading in the Pacific. The 3048th Fighter Group, flying from the steaming jungles of New Guinea, discovered that the qualities which made the Thunderbolt a terror over Normandy, its ruggedness, its endurance, and its ability to carry devastating loads of firepower, were equally suited to the vast distances and brutal conditions of the Pacific War. Under the aggressive leadership of Colonel Neil Kirby, the big radial-engined fighters began carving their own legend in the skies above the islands, proving that the juggernaut built for Europe was every bit as deadly in the tropics. On October 11, 1943, Colonel Neil Kirby led a flight of just 4 P-47 Thunderbolts into a swirling aerial battle over Wewak, New Guinea, facing nearly 40 Japanese fighters. Kirby
used the brute strength and heavy firepower of the Thunderbolt to devastating effect, shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in a single sortie. For this extraordinary display of courage and skill, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, long accustomed to dueling agile but lightly built American aircraft such as the P-40 or P-39, found themselves wholly unprepared for the combination of speed, resilience, and sheer destructive firepower that the P-47 brought into the skies of the Pacific. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who faced the Thunderbolt in combat, later admitted his shock at its durability. "We called them monsters," he wrote. "Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with just a few hits, seemed useless against the Thunderbolt. I put dozens of rounds into one and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, great streams of heavy bullets that shredded our aircraft as if they were made of paper." Recognizing the vast distances of the Pacific theater, Republic engineers developed the P-47N, a long-range evolution of the design. Its distinctive wet wings, holding 93 gallons of fuel each, stretched the aircraft's range to more than 2,300 miles, nearly triple the radius of the early D models. With external tanks, the P-47N could escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan, transforming the Thunderbolt from a short-legged bruiser into a strategic weapon capable of spanning oceans. The ultimate test of the Thunderbolt's adaptability, however, came against Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, the Messerschmitt, May 26-2. Capable of 540 miles per hour, the jet appeared invincible to propeller-driven opponents. Yet Thunderbolt pilots learned that the jets had critical vulnerabilities. During takeoff and landing, when the slow accelerating turbojets left the aircraft exposed, or during a steep dive from altitude, the P-47 could close the gap. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the famed 3052nd Fighter Group demonstrated this truth. Diving from 28,000 feet, his Thunderbolt reached nearly 500 miles per hour, just enough to intercept a jet in level flight. At 400 yards, Meyer's 8 Brownings tore into the May 26-2, blasting both engines from the fuselage and sending the aircraft spiraling into the ground. His after-action report summed it up with clinical precision. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 8 40-50 caliber guns proved more effective than expected against jet aircraft. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants rolled off production lines, built explicitly to counter jets and V-1 flying bombs, with water methanol injection, boosting the Pratt & Whitney R280-800 to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics pushing top speeds to 40-70 miles per hour at altitude. The Thunderbolt could now chase the fastest German weapon. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron, destroyed 2 May-26-2s in March 1945. He summed up the reality of air combat in simple terms. The jets are faster, but they can't turn, and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery, and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack bombers, and that's when we get them. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of American industrial supremacy came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to cripple Allied air power on January 4. Nearly 900 German aircraft, including many of their best remaining pilots, launched a surprise assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield, near Metz, the 3065th Fighter Group's Thunderbolts were caught on the ground, and 22 were destroyed in the opening strike. A captured German pilot, brought before the Americans, sneered at the smoldering wrecks and asked, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking, unshaken, simply pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already clearing debris for replacements. "By tomorrow we'll have 40 new ones," he replied. "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" He was right. Within 48 hours, brand new P-47 D-40s, ferried from depots in England, lined the runway, while the Luftwaffe's one-day gamble had cost them 27 to an aircraft, and more than 200 experienced pilots, losses they could never recover. The Americans, by contrast, replaced all their losses within a week. The contrast was not just tactical but systemic. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 Thunderbolts during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak capacity, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one P-47 every 60 minutes, 24 hours a day. The Evansville, Indiana plant, built from scratch on farmland in 1942, was producing 500 fighters per month. By now, each Thunderbolt was an industrial marvel, requiring 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The R280-800 engine alone contained more than 2,400 components, machined to tolerances as fine as 1/1000th of an inch. Remarkably, much of this precision work was done by American workers, many of them women who had never even seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, yet their craftsmanship exceeded pre-war standards of reliability. The logistics behind the Thunderbolt's firepower were equally staggering. A single combat sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily, consumption topped 10 million rounds per month. By midnight, at the Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone, production reached 30 million rounds every month. Each cartridge was machined to tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring flawless cycling through the Browning machine guns, even under the stress of high-G maneuvers and extreme weather. Fuel demand was equally immense. A P-47 on long-range escort could burn more than 300 gallons in a mission, and with thousands of sorties flown weekly, Allied logistics had to deliver millions of gallons of high-octane fuel to forward bases. It was a feat of supply as much as of engineering, and it highlighted why the Allies, with their factories humming and their supply lines unbroken, could sustain the war until final victory. Each Thunderbolt was an engine of logistics as much as of war. In normal cruise it consumed 100 gallons of high-octane fuel per hour,
and in combat with water injection engaged, that figure could triple to nearly 300 gallons. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was burning through more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel every month, all of it shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty tankers, themselves the product of America's assembly line miracle. But as staggering as aircraft and fuel production were, the real miracle was in the men who flew them. By 1944, American flight schools were graduating 30,000 pilots a year, more than Germany trained in the entire war. Each Thunderbolt pilot arrived in theater with a minimum of 400 hours in his logbook, including over 100 hours in advanced trainers and fighters. He knew how to fly in tight formation, navigate by instruments, read technical manuals, and fire accurately using gun camera footage from actual combat. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, fresh to England in September 1944, embodied that advantage. I had 420 hours in my book, 75 of them in the I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied films from actual engagements. On my first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. For German flyers, training hours had shrunk to under 100 by war's end, sometimes barely 30 before combat. The imbalance was irrecoverable. The same Joseph Pips, Priller, who had mocked the Thunderbolt in 1943 as a pregnant cow, faced reporters again in March 1945. His words, never printed by German propaganda offices, admitted the truth. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its weapons never jam, never overheat, never run dry. It carries bombs like a medium, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But worse than the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots are better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for practice, parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is only delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come. The sound haunts us. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it is overwhelming. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was a force on paper. Airfields were cratered ruins, fuel reserves exhausted, instructors dead or captured. New recruits entered combat with hours in their logbooks, where once there had been years. Feldwebel Klaus Brechtender, one of the last pilots trained in 1945, described his only mission. They came out of the sun, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My plane shook like sledgehammers were pounding it. The engine exploded. The wing tore away. I barely got out. In the parachute I saw them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies.
The numbers confirm the nightmare. In Europe, Thunderbolts destroyed 3,152 enemy aircraft in the air and another 3,115 on the ground. They annihilated 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn wagons. In the Pacific, they accounted for 97 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat, 150 more on the ground, and thousands of vehicles, barges, and coastal vessels. The 9th Air Force alone flew 213,073 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. The kill ratio stood at 4.6 to 1 in aerial combat, all while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. Behind every statistic lay a truth Germany could not overcome. Nearly 28,000 Luftwaffe pilots were killed in the West, their years of training erased in seconds under the concentrated fire of 8 Browning machine guns. By the war's end, the average German fighter pilot had fewer than 30 combat hours, while his American counterpart averaged over 200. Captured records from the Oberössel Interrogation Center revealed the shift in German opinion. The April 1943 file on the P-47 dismissed it as a lumbering truck, inferior in all respects but dive speed, its machine guns insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. By December 1944, the same file described the Thunderbolt as the decisive Allied aircraft, superior in firepower, survivability, and numbers. A complete fighter bomber without equal, the P-47 had not merely redeemed its early reputation, it had rewritten the rulebook of aerial warfare. From the frozen skies over Germany to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, it proved that speed and maneuver were not the only paths to victory. Durability, firepower, range, and above all the industrial capacity to build and replace at scale could decide the fate of nations. The Thunderbolt was more than an aeroplane. It was the sound of American industry turned into a weapon, a roar of 8 guns echoing over 2 oceans, an avalanche of steel and fire that buried the Luftwaffe and broke the empire of Japan. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the P-47 stood as a machine that had done the impossible, turning ridicule into fear and fear into defeat. By mid-1943, German intelligence reports had dismissed the Thunderbolt as a clumsy brute. A year later, the same analysts admitted its high-altitude superiority and deadly firepower. By June 1944, the P-47 was catalogued as the dominant fighter bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet, nearly impossible to shoot down, and devastating in its effect against any target. By March 1945, the final assessment was blunt: the best fighter bomber of the war, firepower, durability, and pilot quality unmatched. Direct engagement unsustainable. The transformation was complete. 4 decades later, in 1985, at a reunion of former German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, old adversaries met at last in peace. When General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, wartime commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked for his opinion of the P-47, his answer stunned even his American hosts. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big heavy fighter and laughed. We said the Americans built a bomber and called it a fighter. We didn't understand. The Americans didn't build a European fighter, they built an American one. Designed for production, firepower, and survivability. In a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and still hit back would win, and they were right." Galland later described his first flight in a captured Thunderbolt after the war. The experience changed his perception forever. The power was incredible. It climbed as though it were falling upward. The cockpit was spacious, the visibility excellent, the controls precise. It was a pilot's aircraft, wrapped in armor. But what impressed me most was not the plane itself, but the fact that America built over 15,000 of these machines, while fighting a 2-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything we produced, yet they rolled them out faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. And those guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano, because of the sound. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The Thunderbolt didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. That destruction came from more than battlefield tactics. It was born of engineering and industry. The P-47 embodied America's industrial philosophy: brute force solutions, overbuilt systems, and reliability through redundancy. Its wing spars could bear loads of 40,000 pounds, nearly 3 times the aircraft's fully loaded weight. Its massive engine mount was tested to withstand over 12 Gs. Control cables were doubled throughout the fuselage, with automatic backup systems in case of damage. Even the ammunition feed was a marvel of design. 8 separate boxes, each holding 40 rounds, fed by electrically boosted motors that kept the belts flowing smoothly, even under violent combat maneuvers. where centrifugal force often caused jams in other aircraft. It was this fusion of power, protection and practicality, combined with the scale of American production, that turned the Thunderbolt from an object of ridicule into the very weapon that buried the Luftwaffe. More than a fighter, more than a bomber, it was a flying symbol of America's industrial might. Every roar of its engine, every burst of its 8 guns, was the sound of a nation's factories echoing across the sky.